The tragedy of Franchot Tone's life when he married Joan Crawford. In 1935, Franchot Tone sat in the audience at the Academy Awards with his own name on the list of nominees. Broadway actor, Cornell University graduate, the kind of man that critics called a once-in-a-generation stage talent. His career was moving in one direction, and that direction was up. Then he married Joan Crawford. 4 years later, his career had hit a ceiling it would never break through again. His name was disappearing from casting calls, from the front pages, from the conversations that mattered in Hollywood. The man who was supposed to become one of the great actors of his era had become something far smaller, a presence standing just behind his wife in every photograph. 33 years after their divorce, he was dying of lung cancer in a New York hospital. And the only person who sat beside him, paid his medical bills, and held his hand through those final weeks was Joan Crawford, the woman who had taken everything from him. He asked to remarry her. She said no. But today, we are not here just to tell you about Franchot Tone. Because Joan Crawford did not do this once. She did this on a pattern. 4 marriages, 4 men, each one serving a specific purpose and then being replaced. 4 children she adopted, and 2 she later cut from her will with a single, cold sentence. A rival named Bette Davis, whom she outmaneuvered at the Oscars so precisely that Davis never fully recovered from the humiliation. And she did all of it without ever losing her composure. Not once. That is what we are going to examine today. Not the film career, not the movie magazine image, but the private machinery behind one of the most controlled public figures Hollywood ever produced. The woman who built herself from scratch. Now, here is the other story. Lucille LeSueur was born in San Antonio, Texas in 1905, the same year as Franchot Tone, in a world that looked nothing like his. Her father left before she was born. Her mother remarried a man who ran a small theater in Lawton, Oklahoma. When that marriage ended, Lucille was left working at boarding schools to pay for her own tuition, scrubbing floors, waiting tables, doing whatever was necessary. Her school records were falsified because she did not have time to attend class regularly. There was no Cornell. There was no Broadway. There was survival. And then there was ambition. And they wore the same face. When MGM signed her in 1925, the studio executives looked at the name Lucille LeSueur and decided it would not work. Too long, too difficult. They ran a public contest in a fan magazine to rename her. The winning entry was Joan Arden, but that name already belongs to another actress, so they gave her the second-place name instead. Joan Crawford. She hated it. She later said it sounded like a name for a shellfish, but she took it. She did not fight, did not negotiate, did not ask for her name back. Because she understood something that the studio executives running that contest did not. The name was just packaging. What was inside the packaging? The drive, the discipline, the terrifying capacity for self-reinvention? That was hers, and no contest could touch it. Within 3 years, she was one of the most recognized faces in the country. By the early 1930s, she was among the highest-paid performers in Hollywood. She had taken a name chosen by strangers out of a mailbox and made it into something that sold out theaters across America. That is the woman Franchot Tone fell in love with. And that is the essential context, because the same quality that made Joan Crawford remarkable is the same quality that made her impossible to survive. Who was Franchot Tone? To understand what Joan Crawford cost Franchot Tone, you have to understand who he was before she entered the picture. Robert Franchot Tone was born in 1905 in Niagara Falls, New York, into a family with money and expectations to match. He attended Cornell University, studied drama, and moved to New York to work in theater. He was not some wide-eyed kid chasing stardom. He was a serious actor who worked alongside theatrical legends, a man respected inside the acting community long before Hollywood knew he existed. In 1929, he broke through on Broadway in The Age of Innocence. 3 years later, he arrived in Hollywood, and unlike most actors who came from the stage, he did not struggle to find his footing. He got work immediately. Good work. Work that showed range. By 1935, he received an Academy Award nomination for Best Actor for his role in Mutiny on the Bounty. He did not win, but that was not the point. The nomination placed him in a category of actors who had a real future, a long, serious, respected future. He was trained, intelligent, and capable of disappearing entirely into a role. And he was exactly the kind of man that Joan Crawford had decided she needed next. The Meeting. Their first film together was Today We Live, released in 1933. It was a war drama. Joan Crawford played the female lead. Gary Cooper and Robert Young were both competing for her character's attention on screen, and Franchot Tone was cast as her brother. Not the romantic lead, not the rival, the brother. Every other man on that set was oriented toward Joan Crawford, competing for her attention on screen and, by most accounts, off it as well. Franchot Tone was doing something else entirely. He was working. He was studying his lines, discussing his character with the director, doing the job of an actor who had trained for years to take the craft seriously. For Joan Crawford, who had spent her entire career as the center of every room she walked into, this was genuinely unusual. Here was a man who was not performing for her, not trying to impress her, not competing for her attention. She noticed. They began a relationship during production and married in October 1935, 6 weeks after his Oscar nomination. The press called them one of Hollywood's ideal couples. At home, they built a private theater in the backyard, full stage, working lights, and hosted performances for friends on weekends. They talked about splitting their year between Hollywood and New York, 6 months each. Franchot would return to the stage. Joan would make her Broadway debut. That plan never happened. It was never going to happen. But it took years for Franchot Tone to understand why. The marriage and the machine behind it. MGM Studios in the 1930s operated on a set of rules that were never written down because they did not need to be. Everyone understood them. One of those rules was simple. When two stars from the same studio marry, the studio invests in the bigger name and manages the smaller one accordingly. It is not sabotage, it is not personal, it is resource allocation. The cold mathematics that runs every large institution when money is involved. The day Franchot Tone married Joan Crawford, he stopped being an independent asset in MGM's portfolio. He became half of a unit, and Joan Crawford was the half that mattered commercially. His roles began to shrink, not suddenly, not dramatically, but consistently. The calls that came in after 1935 were for smaller parts, supporting roles, films that did not carry his name above the title. He was still working. He would always be working. But the trajectory had changed. At every public event, every industry dinner, every press photograph, he stood next to Joan Crawford. One half step behind, or slightly to the side, or at the edge of the frame. The cameras followed her, the reporters asked about her, the headlines were about her, and Franchot Tone, Oscar-nominated, Cornell-educated, genuinely talented Franchot Tone, existed in those photographs as context. He was not invisible. He was something worse. He was visible, but secondary. Everyone could see him. Nobody was looking at him. Joan Crawford, to be precise, did not stop him from working. There is no record of her making calls to undermine his opportunities, no documented interference in his career. She simply continued to be Joan Crawford, at full intensity every single day, and the gravitational force of that was sufficient. When you stand next to the sun, it is not the sun's fault that no one can see you. The years of disappearing. By 1936, the pattern was established. By 1937, it was undeniable. By 1938, Franchot Tone was being described in trade publications not as one of Hollywood's rising actors, but as Joan Crawford's husband, a label that, once attached, proved nearly impossible to remove. The home theater they had built together sat largely unused for its original purpose. The Broadway plan dissolved quietly, the way plans do when one person's schedule keeps expanding and the other person's keeps contracting. Joan's films got bigger, her contracts became more lucrative, her name took up more space in every conversation. Meanwhile, something was happening to Franchot Tone that no one around them seemed willing to name directly. Reports from this period describe escalating tension in the marriage, arguments that went beyond ordinary disagreement, a bitterness building steadily in a man who had entered the relationship as an equal and found himself 4 years in, functioning as an accessory. Watching a career be absorbed into someone else's story, without anyone doing anything overtly wrong, without a clear villain to point to, without a specific moment where it all went sideways. That is a particular kind of damage. It does not announce itself, it accumulates. In March 1939, the divorce papers were filed. A friend who saw them together the evening before the papers were processed later recalled that they were dancing, slowly, quietly, with no visible sign that anything was ending. They looked, the friend said, like two people who still had something between them. 1 week later, those papers were signed. The sentence. After the divorce, Franchot Tone spent years being asked the same question. What had 4 years with Joan Crawford actually been? He eventually answered it with a single comparison. He said the marriage reminded him of the old joke about Philadelphia. First prize was 4 years with Joan. Second prize was 8. Read that twice, not because it is funny, though it has the structure of a joke, but because of what it actually says. It says the experience of being with her was so costly that surviving it was the only reward worth naming. It says a longer version of the same experience would have been a punishment. And it says all of this in a way that is precise, controlled, and entirely free of self-pity. That is the sentence of a man who understood exactly what had happened to him, had processed it completely, and chose to describe it with the dry accuracy that requires real intelligence. He was a Cornell man, after all, right up until the end. After the fall, Joan's full pattern. Here is what Franchot Tone did not know in 1939. He was not the first, and he would not be the last. Joan Crawford's 4 marriages tell a consistent story when you read them as a sequence rather than as isolated events. Douglas Fairbanks Jr., her first husband, from 1929 to 1933, was the son of one of Hollywood's most iconic figures. Old money, social connections, a name that opened rooms Lucille LeSueur from Texas could never have entered otherwise. The marriage gave her access to a layer of Hollywood society that regarded MGM contract players as glamorous, but not quite respectable. Fairbanks was the ticket in. Once she was in, she no longer needed the ticket. Franchot Tone came next. She had the social position. What she lacked, and what she was sharply aware of lacking, was intellectual credibility. She had no formal education. Her background was waitressing, dancing, and survival. Franchot Tone was Cornell, Broadway, group theater, Oscar nominations. He represented the kind of legitimacy that no amount of box office success can manufacture on its own. She acquired that, too. After Tone came Philip Terry from 1942 to 1946. He served the practical function of providing domestic stability and a publicly appropriate home life during a period when her career was stalling and her image needed management. He lasted 4 years and left few traces in the historical record, which is itself a kind of record. The fourth husband was Alfred Steele, president of Pepsi-Cola. After Steele died in 1959, Joan joined the Pepsi board of directors, traveled as a company representative, and spent years staying publicly relevant in a world that had largely moved past 1940s Hollywood. Steele had given her something she had never previously had: corporate power. She used every bit of it. 4 marriages, 4 specific acquisitions. And when each acquisition was complete, when she had taken what she needed from the arrangement ended. This is not coincidence. This is method. The children and the will. In 1978, a year after Joan Crawford's death, her eldest adopted daughter, Christina, published a memoir. It described a childhood in which the public image of the devoted, glamorous mother bore no resemblance to what happened behind closed doors. Systematic physical punishment, rigid enforcement of rules that seemed designed less to raise children than to maintain control over every variable in the household. The performance of perfect family life for photographers, and a very different performance when the cameras left. Several of Crawford's friends disputed the book. 2 of her other adopted children, the twins Kathy and Cindy, stated publicly that they had not witnessed the treatment Christina described. The debate over the accuracy of the memoir has continued for decades and is genuinely contested. But what is not contested, what is a matter of documented public record, is what Joan Crawford wrote into her will. When she died in May 1977, her estate was distributed among charitable organizations and 2 of her 4 adopted children. Christina and Christopher, the 2 eldest, were excluded entirely. The reason given in the document was 7 words: for reasons best known to themselves. No elaboration, no explanation, no acknowledgement of any specific event or grievance, just a final, irreversible cut, delivered from beyond reach, with the same composure and precision that characterized everything else Joan Crawford ever did in her life. She had controlled the narrative of her family while living. She arranged to control it after she was gone. Bette Davis and the Oscar. No account of Joan Crawford's methods is complete without the events of the 1963 Academy Awards. The background. Joan and Bette Davis had been in professional opposition since the early 1930s, and the 2 women had spent the production of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane in 1962 making each other miserable in well-documented ways. Davis received a Best Actress nomination for that film, a nomination so strong that many in the industry considered her win a near certainty. Joan received no nomination. What Joan did next was precise. She reached out to several Best Actress nominees who were unable to attend the ceremony in person and offered to accept their potential awards on their behalf. It was framed as a gracious gesture from a respected industry figure. Anne Bancroft, nominated for The Miracle Worker and committed to a Broadway run she could not leave, accepted the offer. Joan then made a quiet point of communicating to influential figures in the industry that Geraldine Page and Anne Bancroft were the strongest contenders that year. The 2 nominees who were not Bette Davis. When Anne Bancroft's name was announced as the winner, Joan Crawford walked from backstage to center stage in front of the full Academy audience and collected the award. Silver dress, perfect posture, the expression of someone performing a small and generous favor with no personal stake in it whatsoever. Bette Davis watched from the audience. She would say later that it was one of the most painful moments of her professional life, not losing the award, but watching Joan Crawford stand on that stage to receive it. When asked afterward about the long history between her and Davis, Joan Crawford offered a statement worth reading carefully. She said, There has never been a confrontation because you need two people to make one, and she had always refused to participate. That sentence is the most accurate self-portrait Joan Crawford ever produced. She did not fight. She managed. She positioned. She operated in spaces where no accusation could clearly land. And in those spaces, she consistently got exactly what she wanted. The question no one can answer. At some point during those final weeks, Franchot Tone asked Joan Crawford to marry him again. She said no. There is no record of exactly what was said, how it was said, or what expression was on her face when she answered. There is only the account that filtered out secondhand, years later, through people who heard it from people who had been there. He asked, she refused, and she remained. This is the part of the story that resists every clean explanation. If she was there out of guilt, why refuse and stay? If she was there out of genuine feeling, why refuse at all? If this was, at its most reductive, simply the final act of the same need for control that had defined every relationship she had ever been in, then what does it mean that the man on the other side of that dynamic, the man who had lost the most to it, the man who had described the marriage as a punishment, was still reaching toward her at the very end of his life? Franchot Tone was not a naive person. He was educated, experienced, and had spent decades in the specific business of understanding human behavior well enough to portray it convincingly on screen. He had spent 30 years outside that marriage. He had found the words to describe it precisely. He knew what it had cost him. And he still asked. There is a film, made in 1933, in which Franchot Tone plays a man who sacrifices everything for the woman at the center of the story, asks for nothing in return, and remains loyal past the point where loyalty makes rational sense. The film is Today We Live, the first project he ever did with Joan Crawford. He played her brother. The parallel between that role and the scene in a New York hospital room in 1968 is not an argument. It is not a metaphor. It is simply a fact, sitting there quietly, asking to be looked at. The last word. Franchot Tone died on September 18, 1968. He was 63 years old. Obituaries ran in papers across the country. Most of them opened with some version of the same line. Former husband of Joan Crawford, Franchot Tone, dead at 63. He had appeared in approximately 60 films, performed in dozens of theater productions, television programs, and radio broadcasts, received an Academy Award nomination, spent decades doing the work of a serious actor with genuine ability. And the first thing most newspapers chose to tell their readers about him was who he had been married to. Joan Crawford outlived him by almost 9 years. She died on May 10, 1977, at 71, in her New York apartment. In the years after her fourth husband's death, she had withdrawn steadily from public life, rarely leaving the apartment, managing her legacy from a diminishing radius. The rooms that had once been full of calculation and strategy were quiet. She had won, by almost every measure she had ever used. The name, the Oscar, the image, the corporate board seat, the narrative. Every rival who had challenged her, professionally, personally, publicly, had either retreated or been outmaneuvered. She had outlasted all 4 husbands. She had written the final word on the story of her family. She had managed her public persona so completely that it took her own daughter's book, published after her death, to introduce any other version of who she actually was. But here's the thing about winning every room you ever walk into. Eventually, you're the only one left in them. This is not a story about a villain. It is a story about a person who learned from a childhood that offered almost no security that the only thing standing between her and disaster was her own ability to control every variable around her. She never stopped. Not with her husbands, not with the children, not at the Oscars, not at the bedside of a man who was dying. Franchot Tone understood this about her. He had understood it for years. He had put it into a joke precise enough to survive 30 years and still land. He asked anyway. And if you sit with that long enough, with the full weight of what he knew and what he chose to do with it, you start to realize that the most interesting question in this story is not what Joan Crawford did. It is why the people who saw her most clearly could never quite bring themselves to leave. Some people make every room smaller when they walk in. And some people, whatever the cost, make the room feel like the only place worth being. Joan Crawford was both of those things at the same time for her entire life. That is what nobody warned Franchot Tone about. And that is what, in the end, nobody can fully explain.